This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them, Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was taking a bath, splashing happily in the bubbles. Suddenly, the water turned murky, then black, and the bubbles began to pop with a sinister hiss. She tried to get out, but her hands slipped on the porcelain, as if the tub itself was holding her captive. A pair of glowing red eyes emerged from the black water, followed by a shadowy, elongated figure. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgling of the drain, which had transformed into a gaping maw. The figure pulled her deeper into the black water, its cold embrace tightening around her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the water, calling her name, inviting her to join its watery grave. The bathroom grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted figure seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the water was clear, and the figure was gone, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes staring back at her, a sinister smile on its face. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was her own reflection, now completely transformed, its glowing red eyes staring back at her. It was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice, one that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy. But deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, he was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night, she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. Tralalelo, tralala. It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly, and then it shook, as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George, his disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now, it was her turn.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Peppa discovered that her house had grown new rooms overnight. She first noticed it when she went to brush her teeth before bed. The bathroom door, which had always been at the end of the hallway, was now in the middle, and there were two more doors beyond it that she had never seen before. The first new door led to a room that looked exactly like her bedroom, but everything was backwards. The bed was on the opposite wall. The window showed a different view, and all her toys were arranged in mirror image. When she looked in the mirror in this backwards room, her reflection waved with the wrong hand. The second new door opened to a kitchen that was identical to theirs. But the family sitting at the table wasn't quite right. There was another mummy pig, but her orange dress was purple, another daddy pig, but his glasses were square instead of round, and another George, but he was holding a teddy bear instead of his dinosaur. Peppa tried to go back to her real bedroom, but now there were even more doors in the hallway. Each one led to another version of their house, with small differences that made her feel dizzy. In one house, the stairs went down instead of up. In another, the living room had a fireplace that didn't exist in her real home. The strangest part was that in each house, there was another version of her family. They all looked almost right. But something was always wrong. One daddy pig had no mustache. One mummy pig had short hair. One George was taller than he should be. And in every house, there was another Peppa. But she was always doing something different. As the night went on, Peppa found herself lost in the maze of identical but wrong houses. She would think she had found her way back to her real room, only to discover that the wallpaper was a different shade of pink, or that her bed had an extra pillow she didn't remember. The other families seemed unaware that anything was strange. They went about their evening routines as if their slightly wrong houses were perfectly normal. But Peppa noticed that they all moved in the same patterns, at the same times, like actors following a script they had memorized. When she tried to speak to one of the other mummy pigs, the woman looked at her with confusion, as if Peppa was the one who didn't belong. The other Peppa in that house stared at her with eyes that were the same color but somehow different, like looking at herself in a funhouse mirror. By midnight, Peppa had counted 17 different versions of her house, each one almost perfect but wrong in its own way. She began to worry that she might never find her real home again, or worse, that she might forget which differences were real and which were the mistakes. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in what she hoped was her real bedroom. But she couldn't be sure anymore. The room looked right, but so had all the others at first glance. As she closed her eyes to sleep, she could hear the sounds of all the other families in all the other houses, living their almost right lives just beyond the walls. And she wondered if she was the real Peppa, or just another copy in someone else's wrong house.
The night was unusually quiet in Peppa Pig's cozy house. The silence was so heavy that even the creak of the floorboards beneath the blanket of sleep seemed too loud. And then it came, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at Peppa's window. She pulled the blanket tighter over her head, but her eyes stayed wide open with fear. It wasn't the sound of rain or the rustle of branches. This was different, intentional, as if someone knew she was awake. Suddenly, a shadow flashed across the glass. Light, stretched, but unnerving. And Peppa recognized it instantly. It was ballerina Cappuccino. Only now she didn't look the same. Her usually elegant figure was withered, almost dried out. Her legs moved in jerks, and her eyes were locked on Peppa with a disturbing, relentless intensity. She wasn't knocking with her hands, but with the tip of a worn ballet slipper, and each strike sent a chill through the room. Tap, tap, tap. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the knocking grew louder. Now it sounded like a drum, setting a rhythm. Ballerina Cappuccino twirled just outside the window, her movements unnatural, a grotesque parody of her former grace. She spun and never looked away from Peppa, a silent invitation to come outside. At that moment, George stirred in his sleep and mumbled softly, "Peppa, make it stop." Peppa's heart tightened. She understood. If she stood up, it would become real. But if she stayed in bed, the sound would drive her mad. And suddenly, through the knocks and scraping, came a faint whisper, not from the window, but from inside her head. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button under the video." Peppa flinched. It felt like the words belonged to Cappuccino herself, as though her voice was woven into the eerie tune like a broken music box. For a second it was clear. Someone was calling not just to Peppa, but to the one watching with her. The tapping didn't stop. It grew into a full symphony. Cappuccino struck the glass harder and harder, her movements becoming frantic. Her dress whipped like torn fabric, and with each pirouette she seemed closer. Even though the window was shut, Peppa could see the slipper leaving dents in the glass. "Peppa, join my dance," whispered Cappuccino. Her voice was sweet, like a lullaby, but within it was a coldness that pierced to the bone. George whimpered and turned toward the wall, while Peppa clutched the blanket, realizing this wasn't a dream. Then the lamp in the room flickered on, casting light on something even more dreadful. On the floor, right by the bed, footprints appeared. tiny imprints of worn ballet slippers moving toward her, but Cappuccino was still outside the window. That meant only one thing. She could be in two places at once. The room filled with the echo of steps. The walls seemed alive, reflecting the dance. It was as though the entire space had become a stage, and Peppa the unwilling audience. But an audience with no choice. She would have to step onto the stage too. "One more step, and you'll stay with me forever," sang Cappuccino, her voice now coming from both outside and inside the room. The glass cracked. Peppa gasped and clutched George tightly. She knew one wrong move and the ballerina would be beside her, but staying still was unbearable. Then came the loudest strike. The window shattered into shards, and Cappuccino's slipper stepped onto the carpet. She made a graceful curtsy, her eyes flaring red, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. The music of the broken box filled the house, the walls trembled, and the shadows on the ceiling began to dance along with her. Peppa screamed, but the sound was drowned out in the monstrous symphony. Ballerina Cappuccino reached out a hand to Peppa. "Now it's your turn," she whispered, and Peppa understood. The knocking would never stop. The dance would never end. She was next.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.